are all arriving back into the room now, hopefully with cups of coffee well in place and refreshed and renewed. And let's kick off the second part of our session this morning. Now, just want to first of all play us in with a little bit of football. The SSE Airtricity League is sponsored this year for the first time across both the men's and the women's league by the same partner, the same sponsor. And just ahead of calling on Sue Anstiss, who has a great connection into football and women's sport generally across the UK. But the short little video as a campaign launch was something which was of particular interest, I thought, in relation to the conversations today. So we'll just play this while I bring Sue up onto our virtual stage.
That's incredible strike, absolutely wonder strike at the back post. What a finish, what a corner kick, drilled to the back post, and a hell of a finish.
Whoever you support,
whatever colours you wear,
get them ready.
It's all about to kick off.
Get ready to hold your breath.
Get ready to have your nerves shredded.
Get ready to roar for your team.
Because we're capable of anything.
This is our league.
And again, oh, what a goal! What a goal that is!
Let's make it our season.
It's a game of two halves. We support both. SSE Airtricity, official sponsor of the men's and women's leagues.
And there it is, a game of two halves, neither one stronger, better, or should be better seen than the other. A very warm welcome now. It really is a great pleasure to welcome Sue Anstiss, MBE. I don't get too many of those coming into to the rooms with me. Sue is a woman who has been to the fore in terms of women's sport in the UK over a long period of time now, having worked on a number of key campaigns across football, hockey, rugby, and so many more with Promote PR. That business closed down in the middle of last year. But if there's anything that sporting women have shown, they are resilient. And Sue has bounced back straight away. She is driving on with one of my favorite podcasts out there, the Game Changer podcast, and also setting up Fearless Women and the Women's Sport Collective. And I know that there are a number in the room that have joined us from that today. You're very welcome, Sue.
Thank you. Delighted to be here. Yeah, fantastic. I've been very inspired so far by the speakers.
That's great. Well, hopefully we've been putting our best foot forward, and now we want to learn a little bit about what's been going on in your world. I mentioned the wide breadth of engagement and interest that you've got. You've been there over the last number of years. You've got the T-shirt. You've probably got the stripes on your back, as opposed to the show your stripes that we were talking about earlier. Do you think that the momentum which we had undoubtedly going into COVID can be retained? Can it be kickstarted again as soon as we get back to a more normal life?
I do, and I do feel like many, just seeing the inequalities throughout the pandemic, and there has been a concern as whether that will undo all that amazing activity and momentum we've seen in the last 10 years. But I'm an ever confident, positive person. I'm very optimistic by nature. But even without that, I do think just what we're seeing and what we've seen across in the States in terms of the Women's Soccer League, and then in terms of WNBA and the figures, the viewing figures, the cricket as we went into lockdown in Melbourne. I think we've just seen these amazing numbers of viewers and a real hunger for the women's game and women's sport to grow. And I think then we're going to maybe talk about that later, but the deal this week in terms of Sky Sports and the BBC. So these things are going on despite all what's happening. And obviously we have many issues around the inequality in terms of women's coverage, which has been mentioned by Lynn and others before in session. So I think we've seen how unfair it's been, but I'm really confident for the future just because I've seen the hunger and passion that's there to get more equality across women's sport.
As part of your time through lockdown, you've been writing a book which is going to be published in the second half of the year. Game On: The Unstoppable Rise of Women's Sport. It is unstoppable.
Absolutely, yeah, no, it certainly is. I'm with momentum too, and I feel so there's so many different things that have come together to make that the case, and that includes all the stuff that's Lisa and Sarah were talking about in terms of changes in leadership and governance. So it covers all those areas, but also in terms of the sponsors coming on board, people seeing the commercial value. I think as fans of women's sport, with many on this call we've worked hard to watch women's sport in the past, dodgy streaming of sports events, having to hunt it out on social media digitally. So I think it's becoming more into the mainstream, and we're able to watch it and bring others along with us too. I do think it is completely unstoppable. We are definitely in a very positive place.
Football would appear to be in the vanguard. The relationship that Barclays has now with the Women's Super League is a mirror of what it had with the Men's Premier League, back nearly 30 years ago now. They sponsor your podcast as well, Game Changers, so you'd have some insight into the way that they have of thinking about it. Can you share any of that? What is it that has persuaded a global big brand, big box sponsor to really put their considerable heft behind the Women's Super League?
Yeah, it's interesting talking to them actually. I think clearly it's great. They've been a bit ahead of others in terms of brands, and clearly we've seen you've mentioned one of the amazing partners that you've worked with in Ireland, but also the likes of Vitality and others across the UK that have been ahead of others. I think Barclays are very open and honest about part of it for them is around gender equality within their business and how they're seen and viewed by their employees and their customers. And so they can no longer be seen to be just supporting one element of a sport. It needs to be both. It needs to be equal. So, and I think we're seeing that generally across society, aren't we? People waking up to the fact that there is that need. And I think as that filters through, brands and sponsors can no longer just sponsor men's sport because they're customers, and and women make up a huge percentage of those decision making in families in terms of the purchases that they're making too. So brands recognizing they can no longer just support men's sport. It needs to be both.
In a sense, the funding of college sport in America was transformed for women in sport with the introduction of legislation, which meant that if a college was in receipt of federal and state funding, that they should have an equal expenditure on men's and women's games. So perhaps in the commercial world now, that sponsorship imperative of being seen to be equal will be a real boost for women's sport. You mentioned Vitality; they got behind netball as well, which is another sport which has really thrived on the basis of extra television coverage, extra media interest, and really good storytelling about the players. What other sports are bubbling under there that we might look to see breaking through from a UK and a European and a global perspective in the coming years?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think we talk a lot about team sports, and I guess a lot of the stuff I write about or work in is around those team sports, because obviously women's sports we've alluded to earlier, the golf and crickets and athletics are other sports where women have had more equality in the past. So for me on the team sports, I would absolutely say rugby, women's rugby union, huge potential. I know it's amazing to hear Lynn talk earlier, but almost like reinventing itself, that opportunity in terms of the Premier 15s and the Six Nations, in terms of television coverage and sponsorship. So that's just ripe for a brand to come in, and not necessarily a brand that's in the men's space, but a brand that just wants to align itself to a strong, successful women's sport. And also cricket, I think we'll see so much more with the 100 this summer, some big names from Australia and others coming across to play. So I think on the back of what happened at Melbourne, they had 86,000, I think, in the stadium for the T20 World Cup in March last year. I've lost track of time, 2019 maybe, March. But that was such a momentous number. So I think cricket and rugby definitely for me feel, and netball too, are the sports I think that will drive.
Do we have enough bandwidth as fans, as spectators, as, to use that dirty word, consumers of sport, to actually take on enough of an engagement, enough of an interest? You know, this weekend we've got the Formula One season starting. We've got international World Cup qualifiers. We've got rugby taking place. The sporting world for men is a particularly busy one. Is it a real challenge for those challenger women's sports to really sort of muscle into our consciousness?
Yeah, I think there is masses of opportunity still. And I think there's always danger that we feel that the fans of women's sport are just women, and actually research shows that half of the fans of women's sport are men too. So it's men we want to bring in and across to women's sport, but also there's a massive untapped fan base of women that might not have an interest in sport, but would, once they understand and they love, whether it's netball or it's rugby and cricket, actually watching women's sport is very different to watching men's sport. And I think, as Lynn alluded to earlier, if we can start to package it in that way to make it appealing for that audience, I think there's a mass of people that aren't watching, or the people that just come and watch the big championships but don't watch week to week. And the fact now that we will be able to watch women's sport on a regular, knowing when we're tuning in, whether it's 12:30 on a Sunday for the FAWSL now, or Netball Super League over the weekends, amazing coverage. So I think knowing regularly where they can watch, a time and appointment to watch, will make a massive difference. Yeah, I'm certainly ready to watch a lot more women's sport right now.
Great. Life has been on pause, and it can remain on pause for a little bit because we need the time to watch all of the sport that's coming our way. Tell us a little about Fearless Women and about the Women's Sport Collective, that you've gathered together a group of fellow travellers, like-minded, shared passion advocates. What is it that you have been able to achieve and bring to life out of both of those initiatives?
Yeah, the Women's Sport Collective started just September, so 7-8 months ago, and it was really just an opportunity to get women working across sport in all different roles, different levels, different sports, to come together. And we put on some Zoom networking meetings, a bit like this with your breakout room that I enjoyed just then, and webinars and education. And so my colleague Kate Hannon and I just created it to get started, and suddenly we've got 2,500 women as members, which is really amazing. And I think just what we've seen, there's a whole kind of sessions on imposter syndrome and diversity and how to make diverse organizations, so that the personal development as well as professional development. And we've just found women want to talk and share and learn and support each other. So yeah, it's fantastic. A little brand mention that Sky Sports came on board 2 weeks ago to back us and support us, which is fantastic. So we're not for profit, but they're just helping us to grow and immerse ourselves further in the world of uniting women, helping them fulfill their potential. So it's really taken off, and I think it just shows there was a need and a hunger for women to come together and support and learn from each other.
Great. Well, Sky Sports are members of our Sport for Business community here as well, so nice crossover and links there between the two. The Game Changer podcast, as I said, it's one of my favorite sort of 30-35 minute sessions of the week to listen to. It was interesting. This week's one I listened to last night after watching a decent Irish performance against Serbia, and you had Judy Welsh, a writer who I remember growing up, writing about football and all sports in the English media. The lessons that you've gained from speaking to women and the occasional man in terms of their personal journeys through sport. What are some of the things that you've learned from the podcast, that ability to go a little bit deeper with people to learn?
Yeah, it's been such a privilege to talk to so many, only one man so far, and those 57 women I think we've spoken to.
And the balance is important.
We chucked him in as a male ally, but I guess for me, and it's a mixture of athletes, but it's also, as you say, those working in different professions. And I know we talk about it a lot, but resilience, I think, is probably the key thing, especially for some of the sportswomen. I think sometimes we hear about their injuries or they're out for 2 or 3 years, what they have to overcome, and barriers put in their way. The likes of Rose Riley, amazing Scottish footballer, but what these women have gone to overcome, the lack of access, lack of opportunity to play, being held back, and how strong they. So for me, it makes me, fills me with confidence for the future when you just see what it is that they've had to overcome and how they have done, and how they now want to. So many of them want to work to inspire other women too. And I don't think if I'd have interviewed 50 men across the sports sector, I may do, they would have had a similar attitude. But it's something that definitely comes through, that so many of them want to help the next generation of women and girls in sport too.
There might be an underdog syndrome about that we feel as though we're a smaller but perfectly formed bunch of people that actually want to enjoy women playing sport, whether it's for, you know, as viewers, as parents, as, you know, just for the good of general society, but that we feel as though there's that greater level of sharing. Like taking that on into 2021, which is flying by, you know, we're nearly in April already, and yet the year has barely begun. What do you think are some of the things that we need to be doing to harness that willingness to share, to, you know, to really sort of grab a hold of the strengths that can come from working collaboratively with people over the course of this year? What can we do that's going to make a real difference?
Yeah, I think events like this, I think sharing and collaborating and learning from each other. And I do feel there does tend to be that across women's sport, that willingness to listen and learn, that, you know, we're not fighting each other, we know together, sort of raising the water and all the ships float higher, as it were. It's that phrase, isn't it? So I think there's definitely that. I think there's a lot that women's sport's doing digitally in a way that it hasn't, perhaps men's sport hasn't had to do, because it's already had that free to air opportunity to show its sport. So I think in terms of both social media, but also that digital engagement across fans, is definitely an area where I can see, you know, huge growth in terms of what women's sport is doing moving forward. And one of the key things we have to do is bring male allies on board. And it's fantastic to see the men that are on this call, and I know some that, you know, the world that I work in, but I think that's so important. I think, and I'm always aware of that with Women's Sport Collective. We've created this network for women in the sports sector, but change will only really happen if we can engage and work with our male allies too. So I think that's really important at the moment for us.
It is. It's always something that whenever we gather for this conference that I always take very particular note of, and always encourage more men to actually take part. This morning, we just nudged over to 30% representation in terms of male-female. So I was pleased with that, because there has been a sense that, well, if it was about women in sport, then there'd be somebody in the office that would be really interested in that, and I'll give it to them as a project, and them would generally have been her. And the important side of it is that we need to approach this together as a collective, that it has to be, you know, the men who perhaps still are making more of the decisions, they need to be persuaded, and we need to see more of them coming into these rooms and these forums. But 30% in there is okay.
Yeah.
And some really good fellow travellers. I see, just we've got Richard Holdsworth from Cricket Ireland, Ronan Kushilva from TG Caher, who produced that wonderful video that we kicked off the show with, and many more as well. The question that I posed to our speakers in the early part of the session about that one thing. So in a very specific fashion, what do you think can we do? So yes, more acting collectively, but I liked Lisa's one, first of all, that each of us should take one person and decide that we can mentor those, and I think we'll be able to pick up on that ourselves here in Ireland. So from your perspective, looking at us from the outside, what is it, the one thing that you want to do other than publish the book, of course?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I love Lynn's reframing femininity. I think that's so important too. I guess the world that I'm in tends to be around exposure, visibility, media and so on, and that coverage. And for me, it all begins with visibility. And I know we talk about that cycle of we need fans and we need sponsors and we need visibility. But I think if you just look at the deal that came through with the Sky and the BBC, that will then drive sponsorship. It'll drive money to the clubs, but it brings more sponsorship and funding and more fans. So for me, it's about visibility. So it's about storytelling, sharing the stories of the sports that are doing well, whether that's through sponsorship or through exposure, to get others on board. So other broadcasters and also other sponsors too. But yeah, it's visibility is where it starts for me.
visibility and audiobility, or whatever the equivalent phrase of that is. So tune into the Game Changers podcast.
Thank you.
It'll be well worthwhile. Make sure that you get a copy of the book as well. I said at the top that for our Twitter people that posted the nicest photographs of them, watching today's session, and for those who were making the smartest comments, that we'd actually pick out a couple that we'll announce later on this afternoon as winners. And so can I put in an order for 2 of your books?
Yes,
when they're published. So there's your first pre-order, and we'll distribute those and
fantastic
to the winners in the competition. So it has been a real pleasure listening to you over the past year on the podcast, and now speaking to you as well. This will not be the last time, Sue Anstiss. Thank you very much.
We might meet in person one day. That would be wonderful, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Well, there you go. The studio that you see behind me on my virtual screen, we're going to get back in there, hopefully, this time next year. So perhaps we'll be able to persuade you to come over. But thanks very much for sharing that. I hope you'll stay with us, because we're going to look at that world of media coverage now with Glenn Killan and some research that we've been doing ourselves over the last month. But for the moment, for the time being, Sue Anstiss, MBE, thank you very much. Go meet him.
Thank you so much. Thank you.